So first off, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to either be on the call or view the call in the future. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about faxing, and it's sort of a hot topic. And I promise it's going to be more interesting than just dial tone. This has not historically been the most exciting subject to talk about, but I think it's something that's important that people have an understanding of what's going on inside the industry and where things are headed, because it's still an important business communication tool. So I'm just going to try to provide some insight. I'm going to kick it off by talking a little bit about what the current state of fax is, a little bit of the history around it. I'm going to talk about some of the options that are available for faxing, and those options are going to be related to analog fax, fax over IP, fax servers, both on-prem and cloud, and then just a little bit about the trends of what we see going on in the industry. So starting out with the history lesson on it, and again, I'm going to try not to bore you with this content, but I think it's important to understand where we came from and how we've gotten to where we are today, to understand what decisions we might need to be evaluating either today or in the future. And this was interesting. So the first device that would be considered to be a fax device was actually made by a guy by the name of Alexander Bain in Scotland in 1843. So what we're talking about today is a 182-year-old technology, or I won't even say technology, but thought process. And that is, I have a bit of information in this area, and I want to move that bit of information to another area. I'm going to fast forward to 1968 because it's most relevant to what we're talking about today. But in between 1843 and 1968, there were somewhere around a dozen different devices that they had tried to build to solve this problem. But in 1968 was really the advent of the beginning of what I would call what we see today as faxing. And if you look at this slide, you're going to see there's Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, and Group 4 faxing technologies that were developed between 1968 and the late 1980s. And that's really what led us to where we're at today. But in 1968, when they created Group 1 fax, what that was basically setting a set of standards on how these things operated and what it was. And it was really the first worldwide standard that was accepted for the purpose of doing what we call today faxing. The challenges, of course, with it were it was very slow. The average transmission speeds for a page was about 6 minutes. So it took about 6 minutes per page to do it, which made it relatively impractical. And it was used in places, but more frequently information would be transferred being teletype machines, just standard mail, that type of stuff, as opposed to actually having a fax machine send it from one device to another. In 1976, they generated Group 2 fax, which actually took the speeds and I'd say cut them in half, but it doesn't. We doubled the speed of it, so it took the time and it cut it in half. But again, similar to Group 1 fax, it was just sending the information line by line between the two devices, and it was very slow. It wasn't until 1980 that Group 3 fax was launched, and this is actually a watershed moment when it came to faxing. The big thing that it did is it reduced transmission times from 6 to 15 seconds per page. And the important part on this, and the piece that I want to point to, is that it utilized a T30 communication protocol. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But that's actually having that protocol for the session of communication between the devices is what made faxing just take off. So speeds were much quicker. They were quicker because of how that communication protocol worked, and that really helped speed things up. Then in the late 1990s, Fax Over IP was introduced, and this was really introduced because voice over IP became a thing. So we went from having analog phone systems to IP-based phone systems, and that required a different way of handling fax across those IP networks. And they introduced two different protocols, which were T37 and T38. So right now we've got T30, T37, and T38. And then in the late 2000s, we started introducing fax servers, so cloud-based servers, hosted faxing, as well as on-prem eFax solutions that actually incorporated all three protocols, so T30, T37, and T38, to try to handle improving the faxing across voice over IP networks. So the options today that you have for the purpose of faxing are going to be standard analog fax. It's an option. By the way, it's a bad option. We'll talk about that a little bit. Fax over IP, which is something that is relatively prevalent in the market space because there's a lot of voice over IP phone systems that are out there. And then you've got your fax server solutions, which are either going to be on-prem solutions or cloud-based fax solutions or hosted fax solutions. And we're going to be talking for the next few minutes about each one of these things, generally how they operate, as well as what the benefits to them are and what the challenges of them are. So to analog fax, so this is, I've got a fax machine, I've got another fax machine, and we're going to use a standard phone line to transmit the data from one device to another. And again, we talked a little bit earlier in the history of it in the 80s when they introduced T30. T30 was really the session protocol, or the importance of the session protocol is that we have these two devices that are going to use a phone line, and they're going to squeak at each other and make all sorts of noises. And that conversation that they're having, it starts with a, "Hi, I'm here. This is what I can do." The other one says, "This is what I can do." And then that gave them the ability to communicate back and forth with each other. And again, things were sent page by page. That's what the half duplex is. And they were confirming. One machine would say, "Hey, I sent you this page." The machine would say, "Yep, you sent it to me. Go ahead and send me another page." And they would go back and forth until that communication was completed and completed without error. So the advantages to that was it was a long-standing standard. It was around for a very, very long time. It still exists today. And the other piece is because it was such a good standard, we had a lot of devices that worked very, very well with that standard. So it was a very reliable source, and it worked very, very well. The challenge that we face is when we introduced voice over IP or VoIP systems as phone systems in there, they started to have issues with the communications. And the biggest reason why is voice over IP or VoIP systems are specifically designed to handle voice. In simple things like we have two devices that are screeching at each other, which is how fax is operated and how analog fax lines still operate today. Well, the voice systems have a lot of sound cancellation, sound dampening, those types of things, and they were breaking down the screeching that these things were doing at each other, and generally causing all sorts of issues with packet loss, jitters, and buffers, and failure rates started going, and that really started to cause lots of issues. The other thing that I want to put on there, and this is an important piece of information, is back in 2023, the federal government deregulated the maintenance of analog phone lines. So when you look at, PSTN, which is a public switch telephone network, your Ma Bells and those types of phone companies that are out there managing those lines, that infrastructure that's in place is no longer regulated, that it needs to be maintained at a level. And we're seeing a lot of degradation inside of that network that isn't being repaired, which is causing lots of issues related to communications along those lines. And more importantly, with faxes, which need very clean communication from the device to device, we had a lot more faxes that were failing. So that's really where we got into fax over IP. So as we see more and more voice over IP phone systems being implemented, most, if not many, customers have moved to that or a cloud-based voice over IP system. The phone lines became less important, which is why there was a deregulation. It was causing all sorts of issues with faxing. So then we introduced this fax over IP. So fax over IP utilizes two different protocols, which is T37 and T38 protocols. And T37 is a store and forward. So that's basically, it's taking all of the information in, it's holding it, and then it's handing it over to another device. it works, but it doesn't work great. There's issues with failover. There's issues with missing information. And then you've got T38. T38 operated a lot like T30 from the respect that, hey, the device would send the information to another device and they would continue to have communication back and forth with each other saying, hey, it's getting here. So that really became the standard that most VoIP systems leaned on was T38. The advantages to this were T37 and T38 protocols fixed most of the fax issues that we were seeing inside of analog to analog transfers across voice over IP systems. It worked well with most voice over IP phone systems, and it was very widely implemented over the last 20 years or so. The challenges with it is, like I talked about earlier, voice over IP systems are built for voice, not fax. And because of that, again, we're getting a lot of packet loss, we're getting jitter issues, and there were devices that have been deployed. So there's, ATA units where it's an analog to telephone adapter that you can put on an analog line that's on a device or a fax machine to try to help handle the transfer of information. They work sometimes, most of the time, maybe not, but this is a very important transfer of information, and we don't want to have to rely on something that's not as reliable. So again, voice over IP, even with FoIP, is better than it was previously, but there are still challenges with that. And that's because those systems just aren't built for fax, they're built for voice. So fax servers, that really led to the advent of fax servers. And fax servers have been around for quite a while, but the prevalence of them in the last 5 to 7 years has grown significantly. And we're seeing a lot of growth in that space right now. And there's two versions of those, and they're generally serve the same purpose and do the same things, but there are some differences. And I'll talk to you about what those differences are. First and foremost, a fax server is a purpose-built server that literally has the singular purpose of faxing. It handles all the communications well between the devices. It sits into an IP network really well, and they are built exclusively for that purpose. So they do a much, much, much better job. The on-prem servers are typically utilized in high volume environments, and I want you to keep that in the back of your head as you're thinking about what best solution might, suit what our business needs are. If you're a high volume fax user, it might be best to have an on-prem server. It does sit inside of IP networks. They sit in there very, very well. They support both T30, T37, and T38, or all T30, T37, and T38 protocols. So it hits all the main standards inside the industry. And it does a really nice job of incorporating additional devices. So instead of just having a fax machine, you now can have a print device that's going to be printing out the incoming faxes. You can utilize scanners to actually send the information up to it. You can use email to send the information to the fax server, as well as they can support web portals that will actually house the information, so a fax can be sent to a person and they can gain access to it through a portal. So increased functionality, increased capability, better reliability. So the advantage is, again, it's purpose-built. No longer need to have the analog phone lines, so we can actually ditch all the analog phone lines and the costs associated to them. The other thing is, because they're not using analog phone lines, we don't have to have fax boards inside of copiers, or we don't have to have standalone fax machines that have these analog modems sitting on them that give them the ability to transmit. They can just use the standard IP protocols of the devices to send the information around, so that's cost savings also. And it does add in features like email, web portals, phone apps, integrations to storage, document management, content management, lots of additional capabilities that this adds to it. Some of the challenges with the on-prem fax servers is they're not inexpensive. If you are a low volume faxer and you need to have it because there are cases where faxing is important to your business, they can be relatively expensive. You can spend $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on having a fax server in your location just for the 15 or 20 faxes a month you might get. it's not real practical. So if you don't have volume, this may not be a good solution. They do require on-site support. They do require on-site management. And they are also devices that are sitting in your location. They need rack space. They're things that need to be managed by you. The next version we have is Cloud Fax Services. And I didn't say Cloud Fax Server, it's Cloud Fax Services. So these are other organizations that are hosting the fax servers, and you prescribe to them via a costing model. Typically, that cost model is going to be a per page. It is a as a service type of a platform. So again, it's a hosted server. So just like the servers we talked about. So again, it's purpose built. This is better for low volume customers because of the costing model. But again, it uses the IP networks. It's going to use your T37 and T38 protocols. So there's going to be high reliability, and it does incorporate the other on-ramps and off-ramps, so printers, scanners, email, portals, those types of things that we talked about with other fax servers. And again, the advantages are just like the on-prem servers. These are purpose-built devices that are there to support faxing and faxing only. They don't need the analog lines anymore. They don't need to have fax devices or devices with fax boards. We don't have to add those costs to it. It does add in all the features we talked about before, so email, web portals, phone apps, integrations to storage, content management, document management, in healthcare, EMR platforms, those types of things. And again, the costing model. So this is the big difference between on-prem and cloud. The costing model is a per page costing model, and it's not inexpensive per page. But again, if you're running 15 or 100 or 500 faxes a month, versus spending, $10,000 or $15,000 on a server, paying 6 cents a page or 5 cents a page or 7 cents a page, depending on your volume, to have these services available to you is much more cost effective. So really the thought is, how much volume do I have? If I want to move to a fax server system, do I want to do it on-prem or do I want to do it cloud? It's really just a volume question. If you have the volume, you probably want to look at on-prem. If you don't have the volume, you probably want to look at hosted. Last thing that I put out there in a summary, and I hope you found this information to be really helpful. Fax is far from dead. And I actually pulled some stats on this, and I pulled it in multiple places because honestly, I didn't believe it. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I keep saying to myself, fax is going to go away, fax is going to go away, fax is going to go away. Fax is far from dead. When we look at sectors like healthcare, legal, finance, government, fax is often mandated. And again, inside this segment, there's actually growth. And the growth comes from the fact that it's actually considered to be more secure and legally recognized medium than using things like email, file transfer, fill in the blank, right? So again, it's still considered to be a very, very secure way of doing business. And so there's a lot of regulation that mandates that happening. So again, we see a lot of growth in the space. The actual global volume of fax pages has increased and continues to increase. A lot of that is due to regulatory requirements. So again, regulations like HIPAA, as an example, in the healthcare industry, is actually requiring people to still do a lot more faxing. And again, it's considered to be more secure than email and other methodologies of transport of information. So again, as you're looking at your faxing, there are options that are out there. Modern fax servers are absolutely built to focus on ease of use, reliability, supportability, security, integrations with application, and then advanced security features like encryption, digital storage, audit trails, and application integration. And again, I think this is a great area for you to sit down and evaluate. How's your business using fax? Do you have the best tools in place, and what are the tools you might want to take a look at in the future? So appreciate you taking the time to sit down and listen to this information. I hope you found it helpful. And if you ever have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out to us. We'd love to help you with this conversation. It may not be the most fun thing to talk about, but it is an important communication tool in your business, and we are here to help.